Hello, in today's step-by-step walkthrough video, I will be using SPSS version 30 to perform, interpret, and write up an independent samples t-test. I recommend downloading today's dataset before we begin. You can also access this resource in the Psychology Resource Library. Here we have our dataset within SPSS. We can see that we have two variables, senior course and critical thinking skills. In this example, we're interested in seeing if there is a difference in critical thinking between those in an Australian national curriculum relative to those in an international baccalaureate high school program. If we toggle over to variable view, we can see that senior course has two levels, so students can either be in the Australian national curriculum program or be in the international baccalaureate program. This is a nominal or categorical variable, and our critical thinking scores was a test that the students took, and this is a scale variable. Before we can run our independent samples t-test, we need to run some assumptions testing. To do this, we go to Analyze, Descriptive Statistics, and then Explore. Here we move our dependent variable critical thinking skills into the dependent list and senior course into the factor list. If we go to plots, we want to click normality plot with tests, continue. Okay. We can then run our main analysis, which also contains our homogeneity of variance assumption testing. We go to Analyze, Compare Means and Proportions, Independent Samples t-test. We then move our dependent variable, critical thinking skills, into the test variable box and senior course into grouping variable. Click Define Groups. We only have two groups or two levels of the IV in this example, so we click Continue. But if you had a variable where there were more than two groups and you wanted to compare, for example, groups 1 and 4, that's why that option would become important. We want the effect size, and we can see that that is selected as a default setting. We can then press Paste, highlight our syntax, and then run our analysis. To check our normality assumption, we look at tests of normality table, and we're looking at the significance value for both of our groups. So we can see that both of these are above the 0.05 threshold. In other words, the assumption of normality has been met for both levels of our IV. Another way to think about this is that it does not significantly deviate from normality. If we did have a violation in the Shapiro-Wilk, we could also look at our QQ plots and histograms as a way of inspecting normality or skewness and kurtosis values. Our next assumption before interpreting the results of our independent samples t-test is to look at Levine's test for equality of variances. We see here that the assumption has been met. In other words, it is above the 0.05 threshold. We can therefore interpret the results of our t-test. If we look at the mean values between the two groups, we can see that those in the International Baccalaureate scored higher than those in the Australian National Curriculum. However, we don't know if this is a significant difference. So we move down to our independent samples t-test table. Here we look at our two-sided p-value, significance value, and we see that that is below the threshold of 0.05. In other words, we do have a significant difference in critical thinking skills between those in the Australian National Curriculum Program and those in the International Baccalaureate Program. If we look at our mean difference value, we can see that those in the Australian National Curriculum scored on average 8.75 points lower on the critical thinking skills test than those in the International Baccalaureate Program. The write-up for this test could look as follows. 40 recent high school graduates completed a critical thinking skills test, 20 of whom had completed the International Baccalaureate Senior Program, while the remaining 20 had completed the Standard Australian National Curriculum Senior Program. An independent group's t-test determined that the International Baccalaureate students scored significantly higher on the critical thinking skills test than the Australian National Curriculum students. The co-INSTI indicated this can be considered a large effect. If we think about the values that we need to incorporate within this write-up, we have both the mean and standard deviation values for each of our levels of the IV. We report the degrees of freedom, our T statistic, as well as our p-value. We also include the mean difference between our two groups and the lower and upper confidence interval for the mean difference. What that tells us is that the true population mean difference sits between negative 15.77 and negative 1.73. You can access the full suite of resources in the Psychology Resource Library. Follow our YouTube channel for more walkthrough videos like this one.